This week we are looking at Japan's Pacific Campaign. This is chapter 32, section 2. So we're actually going back from the Holocaust. We're looking at Japan. So far we've sort of been focusing on Hitler for the last few weeks. And Hitler at this point has now overrun Europe. Now we're going to look to Japan. Japan also sort of dreamed of having a huge empire, just like Hitler dreamed of having a huge empire. The first thing that Japan does was conquer Manchuria, that is in the northern part of China. That was in 1931. They very quickly, in the next 6 years, they start to try and take over all of China. So the objectives for this chapter, and we have 4 of them, is explain how the Japanese expansion led to war with the Allies in Asia, describe Japan's early battle success, explain how the Allies were able to stop the Japanese expansion, and summarize the Allied battle plan. Okay, that's with 4 objectives. So just to be clear, Japan has already conquered Manchuria, and they're now attacking in China and trying to take over China. They start to realize that China is putting up more of a fight than they had expected. They had expected to take over China easily. So what ends up happening is many of Japan's resources are sort of being spent trying to take over China. So what they end up doing is they sort of develop a plan to take over the European colonies in Asia, and eventually the U.S. bases. These are colonies in Cambodia, parts of Vietnam, parts of Indonesia. These are the colonies that Japan is looking for because they know that these colonies produce a lot of money. So in 1941, Roosevelt, this is the American president, he is starting to realize what Japan is doing. They got sort of encoded a secret message about Japan's plan to attack European colonies. And so they cut off oil to Japan. So they're trying to cut off all of Japan's resources. This doesn't really stop Japan. Japan continues to attack the European colonies and takes them over. Then we have one admiral, and he's Isoroku Yamamoto. He's a Japanese admiral. He is the one who starts to plan to attack the U.S. colonies and naval bases. And this leads to the attack in Hawaii. The Day of Infamy. This is the day that Japan actually attacks the U.S. And this is also known as Pearl Harbor Day. Pearl Harbor is a harbor in Hawaii, one of the U.S.'s islands off of the main country. This happens on December 7 in 1941. This is the official day that the U.S. declares war on Japan. Because Japan is in links with Hitler and Italy in Europe, this is also sort of the day that the U.S. has entered into World War II. What ends up happening on this day is we also have Japan attacking other places like Hong Kong, Thailand, and other small islands, okay? So basically, this is a huge day of attack where Japan is trying to quickly take over other people's colonies and naval bases. Japanese victories. So even though now the U.S. has entered into the war, they have not completely mobilized yet, and Japan is easily able to sort of take over many different places in Asia. One of the first is the Philippines. So at this time, the Philippines is actually a U.S. naval base. So there are some U.S. troops there already. The Japanese attack specifically in the capital near Manila, outside of Manila. And by 1942, all the Philippines islands have been captured by the Japanese. What also happens is Japan is able to capture some of the British holdings or the British colonies. 2 of these that are important to note are Hong Kong and Singapore. So Hong Kong and Singapore, they are actually sort of British colonies or under British influence They are now captured by Japanese. The last thing that Japan sort of has a victory over is the Dutch East Indies. The Dutch East Indies, that's going to include places like Indonesia, parts of Cambodia as well. This was important because these were a good source of resources and money for Japanese. Japan also captures Burma and is already threatening India. India, if we remember, is Britain's main colony. It's their most important colony. We learned about that in like second term, okay? So now Japan is starting to encroach on India as well. The biggest thing to note about Japan during this sort of part of the war, when they're sort of sweeping over Asia and taking over a lot, is how they would treat the people they captured. For the most part, anyone who was an allied power, specifically an American, they were treated horribly. And there are many stories out there still today discussing how the Japanese treated prisoners of war. Prisoners of war are also called POW for short. Of course, we start seeing the Allies starting to strike back. Now, we're going to be focusing on the Americans, but it's important to note that there are Australians also involved in many of the strikes or the attacks on Japan in World War II as well. One of the first attacks is that the U.S., they are trying to bomb Tokyo and other Japanese cities, and this is in April 1942. What it does sort of show is while it doesn't actually provide a lot of damage to Japan, it does show that Japan has some vulnerability. Because they're stretching themselves so thin over Asia, it's starting to make Americans and Australians think, well, we need to start attacking them where it's going to hurt most. The Allies start to strike back. So there's sort of a turn in World War II when we look at the Asian campaign. And that happens when Americans and Japanese, they're able to take over a port on Papua New Guinea. So this is Port Moresby, which was controlled by Japan. Americans and Australians take it over. And it's important because now they're much closer to being able to attack Japan on the sea. The battle that follows is called the Battle of Coral Sea. And the Americans are able to stop the Japanese from advancing in Asia in some of these islands. This is in May 1942. The important thing to note about this battle is it starts a new kind of warfare. What ends up happening is in the olden days, you would have two ships line up next to each other and shoot each other from the ships. But since the technology of airplanes, what ends up starting to happen is we have airplanes sort of coming off of the ships and attacking ships from the air. This is sort of the new warfare that we're talking about here. The biggest turning point for the Americans during the Japanese campaign is the Battle of Midway. What ends up happening is Japan is trying to take over Midway Island, which is an island off of Hawaii. This is putting Japan dangerously close to the U.S. So because the U.S. has code breakers, which is a very important part of World War II, they're able to decode these Japanese instructions on attacking Midway Island. The U.S. then takes their whole naval fleet from Pearl Harbor and from Hawaii and move it secretly to Midway Island without the Japanese knowing. This was done by General Chester Nimitz. So Japan starts attacking Midway Island, and Nimitz, the general, he allows them to do so. Then, as soon as Japan is not expecting it, we have many American planes flying in and sort of destroying this attack. It sort of surprised the Japanese. And it ends with the battle winning for the Americans. They destroy many of the naval fleet that Japan brought to Midway Island. As soon as the Americans and Australians won in Midway Island, the Battle of Midway, they start taking the offensive. That means they are going to start attacking Japan now. They're no longer going to be on the defensive. This is marked by General Douglas MacArthur's plan of how to attack Japan. Japan has taken over many, many small islands. Now, instead of focusing on conquering every teeny island, MacArthur suggests that the Americans should conquer small islands that will be easy to take over but are close to Japan. That's what he calls island hopping. So he's going to pass the islands that are strongholds of Japan and start attacking weaker islands that they know that they can take over. MacArthur sets his sight on the island of Guadalcanal. This is in the Solomon Islands. The reason is they had learned from probably secret messages that Japan was building Guadalcanal to become a Japanese stronghold. They were building sort of a naval base there, but it wasn't finished. So MacArthur and the Americans, they decided they're going to attack it before it gets finished and becomes a stronghold of Japan. This results in the Battle of Guadalcanal. Now, this battle is a horrible battle. It results in many people from both sides dying. But the Allies are able to win this battle in the end. So I want you to think, this is all happening while the Holocaust is happening in Europe as well. Your question for the week is also on page 935. Which event was the most important in the turning the tide of war in the Pacific against the Japanese, and why? So you need to discuss which event in this chapter is the most important when we talk about where the Allies start to win.